We have our last panel of the day, and this is a panel really about commercial spaceflight. Huge portion of our history has been government dominated, and in the last few years, the people that you see here are parts of those companies that have stepped up into the commercial domain, into the gaps that were there, and we're going to talk with them about well, a variety of things, not just this moment and why it's changing and what's important about human spaceflight, but also why are you doing business the way you are? So let me do a quick introduction. So first, Dr. Marissa Rosenberg. Now, Marissa was one of my colleagues at NASA in the Human Research Program for a number of years, and she has significant expertise in neurovestibular science, but then she was stolen away by SpaceX, and she's actually been running their human research program at SpaceX, effectively, for the last few years. So fascinating insight into that dichotomy, the difference between government and commercial spaceflight. The next one, Dr. Dana Levin, is a very close friend of mine, and so thank you for coming all the way. He was instrumental in getting our fellowship started. He was actually one of our assistant program directors at Baylor before. He also got stolen away by VAST, which is one of the young commercial companies that is trying to create the replacement for the International Space Station, and they're doing some very unique things. Dr. Levin is board certified in emergency medicine and aerospace medicine. And then there is Dr. Luke Brane. And Luke, I met the first time at one of NASA's Human Research Program IWS meetings with Faye Tan, who's here, who was mentoring you in PM&R, pain and rehab medicine, these types of things. It's another medical specialty that has fascinating crossovers with human space flight, with the deconditioning that occurs and the reconditioning that we try to do with folks. And so he's also the, the startup, the CEO, the founder of Minerva. So he came out and actually found a hole in the industry that needed to be filled, and I'm going to have him talk about what that is and give some of the background. So this is our panel for today, and thank you very much for being here. So each of them have about a couple of minutes to just chat about some background things and their company. And Marissa, are you going first?
Hi, everyone. One fun fact I don't think you know is my first actual research job in vestibular neuroscience space anything was here at Mass Ioneer with Dr. Faisal Karmali. So I am back at my roots. So that's a fun fact.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he is how I started. So a lot of fun there. But yeah, I've taken a bit of a journey since then, and as you mentioned, I run our research program now, and I think one thing that's really unique about our research program is it's really exploration focused. SpaceX is really singularly focused on making humanity multiplanetary, and I think that is mostly different because I think a lot of the other space companies now are looking at expanding the LEO economy, and we are very focused on just Mars. So we try and find research that can both benefit people on Earth, but also move the needle forward for exploration. Actually, to touch on an earlier point, I think one thing that we really drive home on, at SpaceX is this idea that it's actually existential to us as humanity to get off this planet, and that's kind of like what fuels us every day to kind of push forward. And so I think about that a lot when we put our research program together. The hard part is our platform is Dragon. So we have a capsule. It's, it keeps people alive for 3 to 5 days, and then we need to bring them back. Or we go up to ISS and we kind of like turn it off for a while. We use the ISS resources and come back down. So it's not a very long time to be in space, but we're trying to answer questions about exploration. So it's a very small overlapping piece of the Venn diagram of things that we can achieve in Dragon, but will tell us about exploration. And that is what feeds our research priorities, which are listed up here. The first, which I hope everyone in this room should be happy to see, is medical capabilities. So how can we harness our Dragon missions to really push the boundaries of what we have done medically? Some things that are fun to think about, I'm not saying we're definitely going to do them, but things like a lumbar puncture. One of the main reasons why that hasn't been done on ISS is if there is an infection, it's very hard to treat. It could cause the mission to end much earlier than planned. If your mission is 3 to 5 days, that becomes a little bit less of a concern. So that's just a very far off example of one thing that we could really push the envelope on, but something to consider. We recently, as we talked about earlier, did the first X-ray in space. It's a little bit gimmicky, right? We took it up there. We took a few X-rays. We recreated the first X-ray. But what we really did, what I think is more groundbreaking than just taking it up there, is we qualified it for spaceflight. That's the hard work. That's the hard part that I think NASA was dragging their feet on a little bit. And so now we have been able to hand over that qualification data to NASA so that they can take it and run from there. The other part is we train complete novices to take clinical grade X-rays. So these were graded by blinded radiologists, and all of them said that they are diagnostic quality X-rays. And these people received training from me, who is not an MD, so I also got trained. So it's like a little game of telephone for literally 2 hours, and they were able to achieve that. So those are I think some of the cool things that we can do. The other things on that list are fitness. That's really high priority for me. We have solved the exercise problem pretty well on the International Space Station. That in no way is going to be sustainable for at least SpaceX's vision to Mars, where Starship can hold anywhere from 20 to 100 people. There's just not enough hours in the day to have to exercise each person for 2 hours. So we need to get more efficient, more effective. So how are we going to do that? The other thing that is really important to SpaceX is we want humanity to be multiplanetary. I think when you say that, it's easy to focus on the multiplanetary part, but the humanity part is just as important. And we've talked about today changing this medical system and the way that we think about how we fly people at higher risk. And that's something that we're really working to reshape actively with the astronauts that we fly now. Yeah, so it's a little bit about our program, and I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions.
Well, I'm Dana Levin. I work at Vast Space, and I didn't bring slides, so we're just going to put the website up there, and you can go look through and see what we're up to, and click through all the links if you'd like. But VAST is basically predicated on building habitats. We want to enable humans to live and work off the planet. And right now, Earth is the only environment that we are capable of doing those things in for any length of time. So we need to surround ourselves with this little technological organ system in order for us to survive in space or on other celestial bodies. So that's VAST's overall goal, is we want to build the best habitats we can, and we want to enable humanity to live and work and research and do all of the things that we do on Earth, but off the planet. We're also planning to be the first people to launch a commercial space station into orbit, with the goal of launching it at the end of next year. We just finished the final weld on the primary structure for Haven 1, which is, I think that's actually now on a bunch of different social media platforms. So go to your favorite one and type in VAST, and you'll see the images of it right now. It's pretty cool. But yeah, so that's where we are. We're moving incredibly quickly, and it's a pretty young company. So unlike SpaceX, which has a ton of history now, it feels like a young company, but it's not.
It's not anymore.
Man, yeah, I think your company is of legal drinking age now. But anyway, yeah, so VAST is only about 3 years old, 3 or 4 years now. And we're still building out our science program. We've brought on all the right people, and we're starting to collate things into legible documents instead of keeping them as post-it notes that are spread up around people's computers. So when we get to those points, you'll have a roadmap or diagram of what we're planning to do with research. And my role at VAST is as their director of space medicine, and as part of that, the research portfolio falls on my plate too. So we've merged the human side of things with also the research and some of the payloads and human research, but also material science and whatever else is being proposed. And our goal is to create the platform and then have people like you tell us how to use it or what to do with it. So that's the plan. We want to be the real estate company and get us some places to go up there. Luke?
So, can you guys hear me? Is that good? I'm Luke Brane, or Lucas if I'm in trouble. So, I started my medical career 23 years ago. I promise that's relevant. As a combat medic for the U.S. Army Rangers, and I was in a specialized unit, long-range reconnaissance and surveillance, which put you really far outside the normal medical support infrastructure. And I had to make a lot of decisions out there. I had to plan things out a lot in ways that you don't normally have to. If any of you have been around long enough around Erik, you've probably heard him talk about the knapsack problem of taking medical supplies to various places. And I lived that as part of my initial foray into medicine. So a couple decades later, it turns out that a lot of that information and experience that I had was very useful for me. And in between that time, there's a couple of things. Like I went to medical school and residency, and Erik mentioned that I am PM&R trained. And I took that towards kind of an occupational medicine direction, and was lucky enough during my residency to do a rotation at SpaceX. And during that time, this was in 2021, rotating with the space medicine group. It was, something that, I kept looking around at what the infrastructure was that would support spaceflight from the medical side. And I kept thinking to myself, well, what if everybody is successful? What if this all works? How are we going to support the scale that is going to bring? How are we going to support the ability to flex with the different missions or with the cadence of spaceflight? Sorry, I have to drink out of my tiny water bottle here. So it became one of these things where I kept seeing examples of, how would that work if this were successful and we were going to move people at that rate? How are we going to support that medically? And it became the kind of thing where I kept looking around for somebody that was doing that because I wanted to attach myself to them, and could not find anyone doing that. So I guess it was me. So a couple years ago, I founded Minerva Medical, and the goal was to essentially place and build out the infrastructure needed for commercial spaceflight, for supporting the logistics, for supporting all of the different things that are happening for commercial spaceflight that are different from the regular medical support system. And that's, I think, where some of my background was helpful. I was lucky enough as a company to be able to secure some useful contracts early on. You'll see up there, we are one of the primary medical support for Starbase. We've been working for SpaceX for a couple of years now, supporting multiple sites. They're our biggest contractor, but we expanded from just being able to give ground-side industrial medicine, emergency medicine, to occupational medicine, to physical therapy. And that's expanded to the other sites as well, being able to bring some expanded capabilities that really weren't apparent or to the client until we got there and said, hey, this can also be built out. And that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping with having a company that can centralize some of these capabilities, that we can help bring the same kind of things for commercial spaceflight.
So 3 very different experiences in the commercial spaceflight industry. two of you are physicians, one a life scientist, all highly educated, all struggling to figure out how we take the next step. And I think what their initial stories start illustrating is that, yeah, there's probably a part of what we've got in our collective sort of consciousness of commercial spaceflight that is the things that a company like SpaceX is doing that is now no longer small. And it's actually a little weird for me to hear that, right? Because I kind of grew up with it. To a slightly younger company and to an even younger company that highlights that now there's an ecosystem forming with support needs and other things. And I think one of the things in our sort of viewpoint has been it's all about launching people into space. But all the things that you are doing are not about launching people into space. So, Marissa, you talk about the research program and about Mars and humanity and trying to target things for that. But on the short term, you have worked with, I think if I remember Erik's talk from earlier, there were 31 partner institutions and 36 experiments up there. Can you talk a little bit about the process of doing that and how you worked with the different groups that were able to get their things up there and get tested by the crew and create those experiments?
Yes, I can. It's a lot of fun work, but it's actually why I love coming to events like this, because any experiment that you have in your mind, I forget who said it earlier, but someone said they were just brainstorming and came up with like 50 great things. I think it was Stuart, that they want to fly. I want them all. So my job is really to work with researchers and try and understand what they want to fly and make it work for our spacecraft, for the mission, to maximize their science. And what that looks like is a lot of hands-on time. You get to know me really, really well. I am a team of one, so my resources are a little bit limited. But I think like if you have the dream, we rely, because we're such a small team at SpaceX, big company, but still the teams are quite small. We rely on you for your expertise. We rely on you for your ideas. And our goal is to help like transition them to reality. And we take our expertise, which is both in like executing the spaceflight, training the crew, but also in the spaceflight hardware qualification. So we do all of those at no cost to you. But the model would be that you come up with the idea, you figure out how to fund your own time and your own hardware, and the rest we can support. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but that's kind of how it works.
Even though you're a small team of one, it's a mighty team.
Yeah, mighty. We get a lot done.
So I want to contrast that with Dana, with where you are right now, which is you just mentioned putting the final weld onto Haven 1. And what's coming down the road in terms of these Haven projects is a couple of them, iterative, with specific research goals in mind. And right now, and through the recent year or two, you've been trying to figure out what do we put into the system? How do we create the platform that people want to use in low Earth orbit? Whether it's science, manufacturing, entertainment, whatever. So can you talk a little bit about that part of it?
Sure. Yeah. So the basic idea of what VAST is trying to do is to borrow from NASA's plan of iterative design. Don't run before you can walk. So start with we're launching a satellite to test the hardware pieces. That'll be the first piece of first spacecraft we launch. That doesn't have crew on it. And that should happen relatively soon. Keep your eyes on launches in the upcoming months. But the next step is to put a small crewed space station, which is Haven 1, that will handle 4 people. And then to build upon that to develop Haven 2, which is a much larger, more capable vehicle that would be able to replace the International Space Station and exceed its capabilities. So those are the short and near-term goals. The longer-term goal eventually is to design systems that are able to support us further away from the lifeline of Earth. So think artificial gravity, think longer lead closed-loop systems, those kinds of things. And to do, aside from the manifesting research and business cases and all of that, which really is, the research side is part of my team, but the business cases are definitely not. we have to build a platform that actually keeps people alive and functions and doesn't expose them to greater risk than they're already being exposed to by flying in space. So a lot of what we're doing is, and my role as being as a physician is design side of things. So there's very little clinical work in the initial phases of this. There's a lot of design work. So I am interfacing with engineers, I'm interfacing with researchers, I'm interfacing with other companies on a nearly daily basis. And that's a lot of what it is. It's a lot of the policy writing and requirements drafting and iterating on that and doing risk calculations and using what we learn from the research that's already been done. And trust me, I am reading a ton of studies that have done by many people in this room to gather the information that's necessary to inform what we're doing. So it's translating data gathered as science into a design paradigm and then looking forward to, in the very near future, translating design into operations. So it's understanding risk, designing to lower that risk, and then figuring out how to manage the risk that remains afterwards. It's entirely about risk management. So that's more or less where we are.
So now we've got a second viewpoint, and now a third viewpoint. You're not launching anybody into space, and you're not building the spacecraft, but you found a home in this ecosystem from a medical perspective that is something that was waiting there to be exploited, right? Can you talk a little bit about the road to figuring that out? As you mentioned, you had this background, and maybe it's right time, right place, but I think it's more than that. I think it's also your training, the things that you had been through, and probably some things about you as an entrepreneur that take medicine in a very different direction from what we might always think about here in a hospital setting.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that probably stands out as different from the approach that most people are going to see in medicine here, and with what Minerva is trying to do is, it's more of a logistics problem, and it's more of a figuring out the personnel problem. One of the things that I was seeing about the issue with scaling was, you can have wonderful expert physicians or other clinical personnel, but if you have just one or two of them, it's really hard to keep an operation going, especially when that operation is going to have different timelines. Those timelines might flex. You're going to have problems with a launch delay or something like that. And I noticed that there was always going to be problems with that, with staffing and with keeping, the product of medical support constant and the product of medical support reliable. And, that was one of the things that I was used to seeing on, from back in the day, where it was like kind of depending, it really didn't matter where you were, what part of the deployment or how far out you were from your support. You still had to provide the medical care. You still had to come up with, okay, I'm now this far away from the next place that I can take somebody. What are my pathways to get back to the next level of care? And that was just kind of drilled into me. And I was seeing that as the kind of thing where at this current stage with, I think, commercial spaceflight, a lot of what can be handled is already, the smaller teams can handle those types of things just fine. But it came back to that idea of what if happens when they're successful and the launch cadence picks up and the crew sizes pick up? Where do we go from there? How do we create a system that can reliably provide the medical expertise in the right places at the right times with the right tools and not have it all fall apart? Because there's an economic part to that is also quite tricky, and that is physicians are really hard to employ. And it's hard to keep them busy, and it's hard to keep them in a place where their skills are being kept sharp. And so that's really this very complex problem when you've got somebody who's got a narrow or a specialized skill set. You need to make use of that, but not all the time. You need, them to have some support infrastructure, but only when they need it. But also, when you do need it, it needs to be right over there in that difficult to get to place right now. So that's why, the operations at Starbase have been an excellent sandbox for us, because a lot of those things existed in the same way, in the sense that it was hard to get to. It's a little bit remote for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's a ways away from Brownsville, about 45 minutes. And so we had to do a lot of creative things just to bring regular medical support to that environment, not just the industrial EMS, but the occupational medicine, the physical therapy, all the other things that made, that filled the different holes that kept the population there working and functioning. And it gave, that whole product of personnel logistics a thorough run for its money, because how do you keep the resources for, a population of several thousand people who are, in a heavy industrial setting there and competitive price-wise, but also keeping your own employees feeling like it's worth being employed there. That's a tough set of things to solve. And so, we're not going to be able to use the previous models, I think, of funding medical support. And I say previous models more like kind of like the NASA approach to things, because they were trying to solve a different problem or a different mission. They had, very specific people, the astronaut population that they were trying to keep healthy. They had a government mandate, they had government funding, and they just worked in a completely different way. The commercial market needs companies that can be commercially viable, to be able to support them, to be able to flex with them, and to understand what their needs are from sort of that inside perspective. And so that's, I think, what I was able to identify and what I was building to. And I think it was a big part of right place, right time to that degree.
But what you're talking about, so I had some experience with this years ago with Red Bull and with the StratX mission, just doing medical support on demand on some of these missions that were like punctuated with launch delays and things like that, and just trying to keep my people there was awful. And I was like, I don't ever want to do this again. So I'm really glad you picked up this idea. But it also seems like it ties out to a concept of medicine on demand, which is in rural and remote areas, which is something that's really challenging. And it almost feels like you're starting to bridge into like a type of wilderness medicine. And is that something that you've thought about? And would you talk to that for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Minerva, while we are focused on this in this particular discussion on the space medicine side, we are actually open and currently developing non-space related medical support. Our sort of tagline, if there is one, is that we create custom medical solutions for difficult environments. And that includes, remote industrial facilities. That includes being able to provide the customized medical support for something like expeditions. We've done work for private security who needed tailored medical support for their operations. So we are able to kind of leverage the concept, the product, if you will, of moving expertise and personnel and supplies to the right place at the right time, and doing that as kind of our main thing. We will bring in the expertise as we need it, but that solving that problem of you mentioned of trying to figure out how to keep your people around when something gets pushed back or you have a different timeline than you originally planned for. That's what we have put a large part of our effort into solving.
Dana, you were both internal to NASA and now external to NASA, and you've been able to see the functionality of both sides. And I'm sure you see the good and the bad from both sides, but I wonder if you could take a moment to compare and contrast some of the things that worked at NASA, some of the things that might not be working as go forward, and some of the things that are driving how you learn from that experience to apply things at VAST when you look forward. Yeah,
NASA is optimizing for a very different problem, as Luke was kind of alluding to there, where they're a much larger organization, and their goals are more towards supporting whatever administration is in office at that moment. And they have longer vision goals. They don't have to worry about finances or business cases. They're beholden more towards political will and longer term missions. So it's a very different ecosystem that they're optimizing solutions for, as opposed to the business commercial world, which is a lot more focused on short-term survival to allow long-term goals. So it's just a different ecosystem. And NASA's mechanism of doing this also started much earlier, like the 1950s, and was developing in a time when computer systems and networks and things like that were not as well developed, and it was built to being spread around an entire country. So their structures were built around bureaucratic divisions and silos. So each group would amass the amount of information it needed, optimize it as to the best extent that they can, and kick it over the fence to the next group. And it would work kind of in series. I'm generalizing. There are obviously exceptions to this within the organization, and it has evolved. But that's kind of historically, if you look at where NASA came from and its mission, that's why it has these strict bureaucratic barriers and silos and structures that are that don't allow information to be shared as quickly or efficiently. But what that structure does do is it has enabled an incredible amount of risk mitigation. So they tend not to do anything without checking it 18 times, cross-checking it, signing off on it, and then moving forward. And NASA still does accept a fair amount of risk, but they've become very risk averse in the last few decades or so, with good reason. But this is where their structures are. It's geared again towards risk mitigation, but they're using these structures that were grown up over a longer period of time from a much older environment. In the commercial world, the speed and pace of that development does not fly. Pun absolutely intended. Sorry, Danica. But yeah, so you need to move quicker. Sorry, guys. You need to move quicker. You need to be able to work more nimbly, and you need to be able to work with smaller teams. So we don't have the resources or bandwidth or speed to have a 20-person or 30-person medical team and 4 different sites. I get to have 3 people, 2 people, depending on what phase of development we're in. 1 person when I first started. And that structure means that everything has to be done by a single person, which means that I get to rely on a lot of the stuff that was done before me by NASA or by SpaceX, and I ask for help. But it also forces me to work with other partnerships and people outside of my organization, because I can't be everywhere all the time, despite trying. I did that experiment. It doesn't work. So that's the concept of what we're doing, and structurally it means that we have to move information faster, and we've broken down a lot of those silos. So instead of us being medicine and then I kick it over the fence to engineering, it becomes medicine and engineering sitting 2 desks away from each other, and I start working on a problem, stand up, walk to the guy, say, "Hey, Joe, I got this issue, and I want to figure out how to solve it." And Joe's like, "Oh, yeah, we got to bring in Kelton." And we bring over Kelton, and we sit down and powwow for 15 minutes, and then solve the problem, write the requirement, and get it approved. And it all happens very quickly, which at NASA, that would have been a 3-month process. So that's the difference, but it's not introducing more risk. It's just a more efficient system for the problems we are trying to solve and for the ecosystem in which we grew up, because I get to benefit from having a ton of work that's already been done and faster computer networks and a smaller physical place.
So your phrase there, throw it over the fence, is one that I ran into a lot when I was at NASA. I was on the research side of the house with Marissa, and one of the biggest challenges that I think both of us saw when we were there was a disconnect between those folks who were doing the research, and sometimes things would take years to happen, and then after those years had happened and you had your gizmo or whatever it is at the end of the process, now there's a new chief of space medicine, and they're like, "We didn't ask for that." And it's like, "No, your predecessor did. Two people before you," right? And so there was this disconnect that, the scale of the organization and the processes that had been layered on each other had caused this sense of, I think, people saying throwing it over the fence is part of the problem, right? To develop some of the capabilities to learn more about the human and to eventually use that information to inform medical care, for example. You can't throw it over the fence. You've actually got to kind of walk it hand in hand. And you lived that. And so I'm curious to know if you think about that in the context of SpaceX, can you reflect a little bit about what it was like and that difference going from one to the next?
Yeah, I have a lot of the same thoughts that Dana has. I think I was really pleasantly surprised when I started at SpaceX. I think from the NASA perspective, before I went over on the other side of the fence, I think there is a perception from people at NASA that you move too fast and there's no way that you can be safe enough moving that fast. And what I realized is that's actually not true. It is just a different, very different system of managing risk and like burning things down. And I think the few things that really stand out to me, one is the integrated nature of things. So that's like the hand in hand. You have a single responsible owner for every single project. So like I own the research. If the research doesn't end up flying, that is only on me, and it's because I didn't walk it far enough. I didn't go and do my job and talk to the engineers and, you know, answer any questions they have, any concerns they have. I didn't go up to management and talk to them about why this research is important. Like, that is all on me. And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. So I do think that is a really interesting point. I experienced so many times at NASA where we got really strong feedback for like a motion sickness countermeasure or something like that. And we threw it over to medical and never saw it again, you know? And it's not the doctor's fault either. Like maybe they threw it over to ops and that's where it died. But like the point is you're just always throwing it to someone else and it's never one person's choice. I think the other thing that I was really impressed with are actually the systems. And I wonder, I have never like gotten insight into vast systems of how you manage risk, how you do changes, all of that. And like the system that SpaceX has created allows for people to really buy off on these things. And it's not like a paper signature. Like at NASA, you write these reports and you take them around and you get your 10 signatures and like it goes somewhere. I don't even know what happens to it once all the signatures get signed. But at SpaceX, it's this living online repository, and you have to sign off. And to sign off, you have to have like done all of your homework and actually read all of these things and made sure that you are signing off. And then if something happens, you go right back and you saw who signed off on that, and you ask them, you know, did you look into this thing? Or, you know, so I think there's a lot of accountability and responsibility that comes with that very clear paper trail. And I think the intention of NASA was to have that. It just gets a little bit lost when it's hard to like figure out where those documents are and who's in charge of them and all of that. But I will say, the last point that Dana made, I really want to emphasize the only reason we are able to be one person, two people teams is because of NASA. It is because of all the work that they did. Like I am constantly reading the risk roadmap and all of the evidence reports and stuff that is all like, you know, what Erik put in place. Like I would be sunk without that. So that is, I think, one of their biggest strengths is the gathering all the data and the lessons learned.
There's a huge amount that NASA has learned in the time that they've been flying people in space. And so I think one of the dangers that we can have as we have a discussion like this is people think, well, maybe they don't think NASA's very good. But NASA has laid the foundation for all of this. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the solutions of yesterday are going to be the solutions of tomorrow. And so how we grow and how we change in the industry and open ourselves up to be able to take risks differently or to rethink systems are really the crux of this moment in human spaceflight, in my opinion. Now, I have plenty of other questions for the three of them, and I am happy to keep going with that. However, I suspect some of you might have some questions for them as well, so I want to stop here and first ask if there's anybody who wants to ask questions before I just keep babbling away. Dr. Hoffman.
Yeah, we're talking about commercial space stations and commercial space flight. Who's responsible financially for crew health? You know, if you go on an expedition, depending on where you go, sometimes you have to put down a big deposit in case you have to be rescued. In other cases, the government pays the cost of rescue. Is anybody thinking ahead towards this? I mean, who's got the responsibility?
From a rescue standpoint, or from like a general?
Well, like if somebody gets sick and has to be deorbited, you know, that's expensive. There may be, I mean, you can come up with lots of other scenarios, but there's lots of things that could happen medically which would have a financial impact on a mission. And I'm just curious whether people are thinking ahead to this.
Well, the short answer is yeah, that is absolutely being thought about. Some of the business model cases and exact financial structures are not public information, so I can't get too far into the details. But philosophically and conceptually, the way that this works is if the major spaceflight companies that have flown people or are imminently going to, every single one of them has a medical team embedded within it. They're not ignoring that. They're not, and that medical team is not just there for screening. That medical team usually includes expertise in emergency medicine, and in long-term kind of spaceflight preventive and internal medicine type care. So you've got a bunch of different factors and facets of how you take care of people in space, and the whole organization is geared around that. If you're flying people, this is one key piece that stays connected. So even if the companies started without those, they've added them in pretty early on in the process. And the way that generally operates is if somebody gets ill, then there's the medical team is involved in that. They're either in mission control working with the crew, or there's another mechanism to access them, and that's company dependent. So I can speak at VAST that we'll have medical personnel in-house monitoring the station as long as whenever there's crew up there will be somebody available 24 hours, 7 days a week in mission control. And there's consultants that you'll have on the outside. If you need specialist care, you can bring them in. But that kind of a structure is how the response would generally occur. And then if a emergency occurs and we need to bring somebody down, that is a hopefully never event, but it's something that we plan for. That's the idea of be prepared.
One of the things that it sounds like you're asking is about the overall liability of the situation.
That's also part of it.
Right. And one of the things that's interesting is that NASA, as a government agency, has a very different set of liabilities than any of the commercial companies. This is an area that is not tested in court, right? Not yet. And it's been interesting, some changes that have happened in the recent years, like NASA passed the TREAT Act a number of years ago, Congress did, to say that, NASA was the payer of last resort for astronauts if they were found to have a 51% or more chance that spaceflight caused this problem, right? It's not for everything, but it is recognizing the ownership, and that's a long-term thing. But the commercial companies aren't taking that, right? They're not taking on long-term liability in the same way that NASA astronauts who have a career are doing so. So the real question comes down to short-term liability, and then we don't know because of the moratorium that the FAA has on pushing out regulations. Still, it's kind of a gray area, I think. Any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that, at least from the forward-looking component. So that was a big part of what I was seeing the lack in infrastructure for is eventually there will be a lot of people who are paying customers who are going to space as a paying customer who want to get medical care sorted out ahead of time and who also consequently at the end of it need to be cleared, right? They get back from flight, whatever the flight duration was, whatever the exposure was, and they get cleared at some point to go back to life, drive a car, do anything else that might have been impacted by the spaceflight. And that's not really what most spaceflight companies are set up to do. They're set up to build hardware and do all the processes for that. But a medical practice is sort of by definition set up to do that. And so I already do that every day with workers who work in dangerous areas of industrial sites where I have to determine if they're cleared to go back into that site, or I've assessed them after a acute event and decide kind of what's happening with them. And so, there is a possible framework of kind of an expanded version of that, a relationship between medical practice that is set up for that kind of thing and spaceflight providers such that they don't have to take on the medical legal liability for things like clearing the personnel, say, post-flight. That is one of the things that I was seeing as, what are we going to, NASA, as Erik mentioned, NASA had a completely different way of handling it because there are different a different mission, different organization, different set of criteria. Private citizens paying customers, it would be somewhat like a informed consent type of thing, like you would do for any sort of a big expedition. You sort of acknowledge there's a bunch of risks in here and I know what I'm getting into. However, I can at least accept that there should be this much medical support and this much medical surveillance associated with this event. And now we have our exchange, and that's the economics of it. So that's what I am looking to have in place and can provide for spaceflight from the commercial side.
It's another one of those details that you kind of lump together into that word logistics.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there. All right, more questions.
Thank you for your question, because it actually leads into what I wanted to talk about. Because really what you're asking about is the liability regime. And one of the big gaps right now is there is not a clear liability regime for orbital platforms like we do have for launches. So also, Luke, I wanted to acknowledge you are correct. It is very hard to manage doctors. So just putting that out there. But so my question to you, building on the question of the not complete liability regime or vague liability regime that's in place, is what kinds of policy or regulatory changes would be enabling for you as you think about sending humans on a more permanent basis into space as commercial providers?
I'll take a stab at some of that. I think that's a very good question, which is unsurprising coming from you, but it's a longer answer that requires a bit more thought than I'm going to be able to give it right away. As a baseline estimation, I think that some understanding, some regulation around where medical malpractice laws end or transfer over, and some structure like what exists for cruise ships. So a lot of it's going to be the things that are unpleasant to think about, where if somebody dies on orbit, and they launched from the US in Florida, but they're a resident of Japan, and the vehicle is registered in California, who signs the death certificate? Who owns that body? How does that get transferred? Those kinds of questions are things that would need to be regulatorily answered. An understanding to some extent if there are basic guidelines of steps that need to be followed, or structures of support that could exist. So if there's an accident, can I, as the medical director, activate an accident investigation? How do I gather support? Can I activate people other than my own social network and picking up a phone and calling some of the people I know over at NASA or at Minerva and saying, hey, I want your expertise. Are there mechanisms or ways that we can activate or pull on government resources or other things along those lines? So things like that, where it's the network, it's filling in those gaps. And I'm using extreme examples because those are the easiest to think about, but that'll exist for everything that would occur up there.
NASA physicians always had the advantage that being federal workers, they could cross state lines. Luke, are you running into the challenge of multi-state licensing?
Just about to.
This is a reality, and there's also some models for that, like professional sports teams who bring their doctors along and stuff like that. So when you're asking about policy questions, that was one of the ones that came to mind, because the NASA physicians didn't have to worry about that with the federal pathways that they had. And now in the private world, it's a different structure legally. Other questions?
Dana kind of stole my thunder, which is not surprising, about the death in space question. But this gets back to what kind of we talk about all day. Is, Marissa, you said Starship has maybe 100 people on it. Erik, you talked earlier that 3.7 fatal events within the first 6 years of ISS or whatever it was. What are you going to do when you start losing people on a trip to Mars, A, and B, when you talk about the cruise ship model, I know that some people have been cruise doctors on expedition class cruises. Do you send a doctor among those 100 people to Mars, or how do you train that doctor? What's that doctor trained to do? Because I imagine that the doctor, even to Antarctica, probably has some telemedical support. And what do you do when you don't have that ability?
You want to talk about that first? What's SpaceX's view on that?
Yeah, I think, don't hold me to anything at this point. Like, to be frank, we're we have not solidified our plan for any of those things. However, I can see if we're really sending 100 people, which probably is not going to be our first mission to Mars, it would definitely make sense to have some of those people be workers and some of those people be passengers. And so you can imagine that probably one of those workers would be a medical professional, maybe two for redundancy. But this is, completely hypothetical at this point.
You're asking a big question, Tovi, and what I'll tell you from NASA's perspective, at least what has happened in the past, is that in NASA 3001, for a long time they had levels of care. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 being planetary or equivalent, which was planetary or over 280 days. In that case of mission, it was part of the standard to include a physician. And in 2020 or 2021, the OCHMO office redid 3001 and removed that from the standard. And what they were trying to put in place was please go look more deeply into the mission you're doing and figure out what the right thing to do is. So the standards have changed as we've learned more, but I don't think anybody really has an answer for that question yet. And it's going to be coming up because the lunar missions that are coming up, if you're actually going to stay there for a year, right, that would have been covered by something like that. So do we need it is a question for the community to answer, honestly. Like, what's the benefit and what's the risk? And when somebody dies in space, Dana?
Well, I'm not going to be the one that kills him.
I just want you to know that Dana's sleeping on my couch, and the conversation that we had last night was like, exactly this, right? What happens? Good luck.
Thanks. Well, I will say that some of the stuff that we would do is to draw from the research of Dr. K-Mine et al. And finding out how to do telementoring of people. I'm calling out Tovi specifically because he's done a bunch of research on this kind of training and what is and is not possible. But that's apropos of what Erik is talking about here. It's drawing on the community of people like this to do that research and figure out where are the limits. The concept that we're charged with is managing the risk that does exist. If we have a mission that is taking off tomorrow, we've got to manage the risk with what we know today, and that's what operations is. We can do some work on the design side to say, hey, with the information we currently have, how do we lower that risk by mitigating it in design, planning to fly 1 physician, 2 physicians, a telementoring setup, a quantum entangled communicator, whatever. But the other aspect to it is that that's unspoken, at least for now, is the research side of it, which is answering those long-term questions. What is the risk? Let's quantify it. Are there ways that we can build devices or protocols or techniques or strategies that will lower that risk to an acceptable threshold and and we can mitigate it before we even start designing? And that's a huge part of this. That's the work that NASA did that got us to the point where we are able to do the missions we're doing now. So we need to charge us as a community, and I mean that literally, including us in this room and outside of it and all of our networks, with figuring out what those risks are, doing that research, and informing what will become the operational state and the liability paradigm.
Right, we are getting close to the ending time, so Danica Vallone, who I'm going to say, by the way, as just along the lines of piece of information, you see 3 logos up on this thing, right? The SpearMed for MGB and Lonnie's Aerospace Physiology Lab. The other one is OSMED, the Organization for Space Medicine, Engineering, and Design. Danica is one of the board members of OSMED. She's been supporting not just this conference, but lots of other things. And so I wanted to make sure that I tie all of that together for all of you quickly, but you have a question.
Thanks, Dad. My question is actually about legacy, right? So this is a new space versus NASA panel discussion. That's the primary theme, right? And no greater legacy in the history of humankind than NASA's, right? In terms of brand recognition. It's on stickers and Wheaties boxes and, lunch pails and T-shirts around the world. You can travel anywhere and you see the meatball or the worm floating around somewhere, right? And that is deeply meaningful and lasting. And so NASA's legacy is cemented, though changing. And for you guys as new space, medium young and extra young company, at what point do your organizations start thinking about legacy, start imagining the lunch pails and the meatballs spread around the world? And at what point and where in the conversation are you sort of sculpting what you think the world will come to feel and think when they see SpaceX or VAST or whomever the next comer may be?
I can start off and just say, I think for SpaceX, we're there. I see a very intentional messaging and very intentional branding, and this idea, it is literally every single choice I make, I need to answer how it will make humanity multiplanetary. And I think it's that singular vision that really will, hopefully, we will become successful in that, and that will be our legacy. So I think the benefit of being medium old is that we've had some time to really build that up. So it's a great
You guys
question.
still look great, though. That's the branding.
No, not too many gray hairs yet.
No, Dana, you're not the young.
All right. Well, I will speak to it from the fact that VAST has one of our largest teams is the branding and marketing team. So it is the mess, and our CEO came from a background of marketing and branding. So having sat in on these conversations with the caveat that I am not an artist or designer, and my design sense is terrible, but...
It's a nice jacket, though.
Touche, Eric. Thank you for letting me borrow it. The concept of this, though, is that I've sat in every meeting that I've sat in that has anything to do with the design or external-facing element of our station, website, merchandise store, all of that. Even the comms meetings that I have around presenting or setting up a presentation involves someone, and I know all of their names, carefully picking through whatever I've created and adjusting the millimeter of where I've placed the picture on the slide, adding a little color change here or tweaking things. And website elements or forward-facing big public announcements do not go out the door without a round-the-clock discussion, whirlwind information about putting that out there. That, I think, is probably true for a lot of companies. This is just my first exposure to it. And that concept of telling the story of what you're doing is integral and very much a part of what VAST's DNA is. And I think the more I've been involved in this, I've been on the luxury side of being in the academic medical world and saying, the story doesn't matter. I just need to teach it and I need to understand it. It doesn't work that way. You got to be able to tell that story, and you got to be able to broadcast it out to a much wider audience. So I have learned a ton from that side of the community, and I would say it's very much a part of what VAST is doing right now, at least as far as I have been at that place.
Very, very young.
Well, I don't have a marketing department. Brenda does all my work. She's in the back. Thanks, Brenda. But we're sort of in that phase of transitioning from being kind of a quiet in the background company to being a little bit more outward facing as we're collecting additional work and clients. But I think that actually, to me, the question for what I'm trying to do is a pretty simple one, because I think there's only really one thing that kind of overarches all components of medicine when you're practicing medicine or you're charged with practicing, anything that's related to healthcare, and that's trust. So I want Minerva's brand or Minerva's legacy to be not just for our patients, but for any client, companies who might say, we want to hand over the care of all of our personnel, our own astronauts, our own employees, or paying customers that, all they have to do is think about Minerva as a company, and the trust goes with that. So that's sort of, for me, the only thing that I need to focus on.
All right, thank you for that. I am going to stop there. That's okay. And make sure that we have a couple moments for closing remarks. Please, let's thank our panelists. much appreciate it.